What if I told you that America and Malaysia share one strange connection? That the birth of the United States of America and the birth of British Malaya was set in motion through one man, 1 year, one decision that rippled across 250 years. Cornwallis. That's the name that's carved onto the fort's gates. This spot is 9,000 miles from where he lost the war. This is the story of how losing America accidentally created Malaysia through the long arc of history. Lieutenant General Lord Charles Cornwallis belonged to the English aristocracy. As a young officer, he fought alongside the British forces in many wars, including against the Prussians in the 7-Year War. By the time the American Revolution broke out, he was a competent soldier, not solid, but good enough, and he was sent out to fight the revolutionaries in the American colonies. In the battlefield, Cornwallis had real moments of skill. He won several battles, in fact, in Pennsylvania, in South Carolina, but Cornwallis had a problem. His problem was his own boss. You see, he answered to a general named Sir Henry Clinton. Clinton and Cornwallis did not agree on many tactical matters. That dysfunction caught up with both these men in Yorktown, Virginia. By the autumn of 1781, Cornwallis was trapped in Yorktown, Virginia. He waited for a rescue fleet. His boss, Clinton, kept promising it, but Clinton never sent it. Instead, the French Navy showed up. 5 days later, on October 19th, the British surrendered. Here is an interesting detail that matters. It tells you what kind of a man Cornwallis was. You see, he did not even attend his own surrender ceremony. Instead, he sent his deputy, General Charles O'Hara. So, Charles O'Hara rode with the British troops to the surrender ceremony, where General George Washington was waiting with his troops, and the French troops were also there who aided the Americans, watching in glee. O'Hara, instead of handing over the sword to General Washington, he rode up to the French instead, as if to tell the Americans, you would not have won this war had it not for the French. But the French commander refused to take the sword, and he pointed it towards General George Washington. So O'Hara rode up to Washington to hand over the sword. But General George Washington also refused to receive the sword because he would not take it from anyone lesser in rank than General Cornwallis himself. But by any normal logic, that should have been the end of General Charles Cornwallis. It wasn't. 7 months after Yorktown, the British government came calling. They had an offer for Cornwallis: command all of British India. Cornwallis said no. For 4 years, he kept refusing. He was still bitter about Clinton's interference. He had no wish to serve under divided command again. So it took several years of pressure from the Prime Minister of Britain at that time, William Pitt, to make Charles Cornwallis change his mind. And finally, in February 1786, 5 years after Yorktown, Cornwallis finally agreed, but on one condition. He wanted total, undivided authority, civil and military command in one office. London agreed. Cornwallis therefore became the Governor General of Bengal. He was also Commander-in-Chief of all British forces in India. He was now arguably the most powerful British official in all of Asia. Cornwallis's American defeat and his Indian career were connected by more than a coincidence. You remember I mentioned about the ruler of Mysore, where the British were fighting at one time? The American revolutionaries were also watching that war at that time, because so long as the British were distracted with other wars, it would have less soldiers to fight against them. So for a few critical years, the Mysore ruler's army did the American revolutionaries a favor without actually meaning to. Then the irony lands. Now that Britain had lost the American colonies, London finally decided that it needed someone to deal with Mysore properly. The man they sent was Charles Cornwallis. He was fresh off to losing to the American revolutionaries, and now he led the war against Mysore, the very kingdom that had quietly helped America win. Charles Cornwallis won. At the time that Cornwallis was preparing to take up his post in India, the East India Company had its eye on Penang in Southeast Asia. Its reasons were threefold. Number one, Britain needed a naval base somewhere between India and Southeast Asia because the French were threatening the Indian coast. And number two, Britain had a very important trade with China, tea mostly, and they needed a supply place somewhere in between. Number three, they needed a collection point to collect the tin and spices that came from the Malay world. So the East India Company offered to lease Penang Island from the Sultan of Kedah. Sultan Abdullah offered to lease Penang on condition that the British supported Kedah militarily against the Siamese and the Burmese kingdom that were threatening Kedah at that time. And he also wanted a payment of $30,000 per year. Those conditions, of course, were sent through the East India Company in India to London for an answer. But London never answered in time. But guess what? The East India Company didn't wait either. Instead, it sent a trader by the name of Francis Light to Penang to take the island anyway. So on 11th of August 1786, a month before Cornwallis arrived in India, Francis Light raised the British flag on Penang. That made the occupation unlawful. There was no treaty, but the company didn't care. Soon after that, Light built a small stockade on the beach. He named it after his new boss in Calcutta, Fort Cornwallis. Yes, the very same Fort Cornwallis in Penang today. But here's the irony. The man it honored wasn't even sure that the island was worth keeping. You see, Charles Cornwallis' letters show that he was not actually entirely convinced that the swampy island was worth the money. But the Sultan of Kedah was still waiting for his protection, waiting for his payment. For 2 years, the British gave vague answers. Light gave him some kind of answers, that it was coming and so on and so forth. Finally, in June 1788, the British finally said no, they would not defend Kedah. It's not hard to guess why Calcutta said no. Charles Cornwallis had just spent 6 years watching Britain bleed money on a promise it couldn't keep in America. He wasn't about to make the same promise again, not for a swampy island that most of London had never heard of. The Sultan felt cheated. He was right. In fact, he was cheated. So in April 1791, the Sultan gathered a war fleet at Parai. His plan was simple, to drive the British out. But Francis Light heard of the plan the night before, and therefore he gathered his forces before the Sultan could strike. Francis Light struck, and he scattered the Kedah fleet. Therefore, the Sultan was forced to sign a peace treaty. Kedah was forced to recognize the British control of Penang. But, the British didn't stop there. In 1800, Britain took a strip of land across the water on the main peninsula, a strip today that's known as Province Wellesley. So a new treaty followed. Penang and Province Wellesley both were ceded to the East India Company in perpetuity for $10,000 a year only. Fort Cornwallis was later rebuilt, brick and stones that you see today, no longer wood, and it became the largest standing fort in British Malaya. Yorktown grew around it. It became Britain's first permanent foothold on the Malay Peninsula. And here comes the final coincidence. History likes its symmetry. In 1805, Britain wanted to send Lord Cornwallis for a second term as Governor General in India. This time he was already old and ailing, Cornwallis barely made it to his post. He died in October that year, just 5 months after arriving. That same year, 1805, Penang was formally raised to the rank of the fourth presidency of British India, equal now in status of Calcutta to Madras to Bombay. Penang was founded in 1786, the year Cornwallis took command. It carried his name. Now in 1805, the year he died, Penang reached its peak. He never planned that timing. Nobody did, but it's hard not to notice. From that one beachhead, the rest followed. Singapore in 1819, Stamford Raffles secured it. Malacca in 1824, the Dutch handed it over in exchange for the territory in Bencoolen. By 1826, the three of them were joined together, Penang, Malacca and Singapore, into one single administrative unit known as the Straits Settlements. And that is the direct ancestor of British Malaya and eventually of modern Malaysia. So now you can see British colonial rule in Malaysia can be traced back to one man's defeat in Yorktown against the American revolutionaries, Charles Cornwallis. What does this story actually tell us? The American Revolution didn't just create the United States. It redirected British imperial ambition eastward. And that redirection created the conditions for British Malaya and ultimately modern Malaysia. The next time you walk past that fort in Penang or see it in a photograph, remember what it actually represents. It represents that strange link between America and Malaysia. If you like this video, kindly hit the like and subscribe button. Thank you very much.